Welcome to the Growing Green Ventures podcast, where we listen to stories from impact entrepreneurs from across different sectors and industries, learning the real steps it takes to create a business with lasting impact. Today, I had the pleasure of speaking with Miranda Massie, the founder of the Climate Museum, the first museum in the United States dedicated to the climate crisis. Now, this museum mobilizes the power of arts and cultural programming to accelerate and shine light on the silent majority. There are 2/3 of the American people that show a clear bipartisan support for bold climate policy. Now, yet, due to the current and past cultural conversations around climate change, many of us feel like we're in the minority, actually, and that most Americans are indifferent to the climate crisis, which only yields a culture of silence and passivity on the topic. The Climate Museum, through exhibitions, speaking engagements, art, and activism, provides spaces that shine light on the supermajority and provides educational content and experiences around these topics. Now, museums are an integral part of society and an inextricably trusted institution, according to the American Alliance of Museums. Museums are the most trusted public institution and only second trusted source of information after friends and family. Educating visitors and participants on the climate crisis, the environmental overlap with social injustices, and highlighting artists and activists' work across the country and the globe is key to the Climate Museum's mission. In this conversation, we speak with Miranda on her journey growing a career in law as a social justice lawyer to transitioning into creating this nonprofit museum and the light bulb moment that she had when coming up with the idea and so much more. Hope you guys enjoy. Thank you. Miranda, thank you so much for your time today, and I appreciate you joining the Growing Green Ventures podcast. We're really excited to have you on board. Before we jump in, I would love for you to just give a quick introduction to yourself and, of course, your work at the Climate Museum.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. I'm delighted to be here. I'm so glad that you all are embarking on this project. It's incredibly important, and I'm very proud to be featured as one of your first guests. So thank you again for the invitation. My name is Miranda Massie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the director of the Climate Museum, which mobilizes the power and the pleasure of arts and cultural programming to invite our visitors into a greater sense of their own agency, a greater sense of their own ability to take meaningful civic action on the climate crisis, and to connect that with the justice crisis that we also confront as humanity. So that's the top line.
What's clear about the Climate Museum, and of course your work as previously as a lawyer, is this sort of idea of doing good for humanity. And I'm curious, Miranda, this idea of doing good, and however that means to you and to others that are listening, where does this drive come from? Where does this idea of helping others stem from?
Well, there are a lot of extraordinary leaders who've made this point, and I'll try to paraphrase Dr. Martin Luther King on it. The greatest joy and sense of meaning comes from trying to be of service to humanity. And it's by far the most rewarding work that a person can have the privilege of doing. And I think that there are some ways in which it starts there. I'm a hedonist, and it's the work that feels best. So there's that. It's the work that gives you the greatest sense of connection to something bigger than yourself. It's the work that gives you a sense of purpose that feels like it's opened up to the world and not just narrowly focused on materialism and self-advancement. I'm hugely ambitious and hugely for ambition in other people. But if it's ambition only for yourself, or ambition only for yourself in financial terms, then that's just dusty and boring and ends up ruining your relationship to the rest of the world. So lots of ambition, but directed toward how we can advance as a people, as a human species, is the way to go from my perspective.
No, that makes total sense. Is it fair to say that that's also what drove you when you were working as a lawyer? Can you give some
Yes.
context into your educational background and then, of course, what got you into working with the law? before
Yes.
going into the Climate Museum?
Yes. I was a civil rights and racial justice trial
Hmm.
lawyer for a number of years before
Hmm.
turning to the Climate Museum. First, working in relatively traditional areas of civil rights litigation, like education, which was my primary focus, racial justice in education and also employment. And then branching out into environmental justice, which, as your listeners will largely know, is the intersection of environmental law and policy with questions of social justice, in particular, but not exclusively racial justice. And um, the first transition was from traditional civil rights areas of work to environmental justice. And that happened because looking around, I came to feel that the equal right to thrive in your environment as an organism is a precondition for enforcing any other meaningful civil rights gain. So, in other words, if you are being besieged by toxics or by an unhealthy environment that's structured by the racism of our society, you have a very hard time enforcing your right, for example, to equal and integrated schooling. That's the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, and the more common scenario, frankly, that all just falls away. So I went from seeing the terrain of the environment as a place for the advocacy of and for people with a lot of social privilege, to understanding it almost in the opposite way as a primary site of inequity that where justice needed to be advanced. And that was pivot number one. And then pivot number two was that the climate crisis kept coming calling on my consciousness. It kept knocking on the door, and I kept telling it to go away. So anybody out there who's listening, who's thinking about climate and doesn't quite know what to do, or has experienced a lag in between having an awareness about the climate crisis and feeling like you want to explore taking action, you are not alone. It was a long gap for me. It was a very long lag, and I think we need to show ourselves a lot of self-compassion, because it is an overwhelming subject to contemplate wrapping your arms around, and an overwhelming subject to think about on a daily basis before you start. And once you launch yourself into working on it, that in itself is extraordinarily helpful. And you build bonds of fellowship with either fellow volunteers or colleagues, whatever the context is. You don't have to start a new organization or dedicate your job exclusively to climate change. But once you start working on it in whatever way makes sense to you, you will feel better. But you don't know that for sure until you start. So I put it off for a really long time. And I was sitting in my apartment, my blacked out apartment. I was completely unharmed, but I lost electricity during Superstorm Sandy. And something in me shifted, and I felt I really have to stop pushing the climate crisis away and start dedicating my energies to it somehow. And within a couple of days of that moment, the idea for a museum that would be dedicated to climate change and that would help draw the broad public, including the activist public, but extending beyond the currently engaged activist public on climate, into the climate conversation, came into my mind totally fully formed. I was certain that I had read about the Climate Museum somewhere and was just half plagiarizing, half remembering. And was astounded to learn that we would be the first in the US and one of the very first institutions like this in the world. So it seems so obvious to me, such a no-brainer, that a museum, because museums are very popular and very trusted. I now know that from social science studies. At the time, it was just an intuition. They're so trusted and so popular. What better way to help people find their footing and raise their voices together for change?
Miranda, a lot of the times entrepreneurs create an institution or create an organization when it comes to solving a problem, right? They've identified a problem out there in the world, in the market, X, Y, and Z, and then they create a solution around that. It sounds like you this idea of wanting to address the climate change was boiling up in your life at this time, and then during this moment you had this idea for the climate museum and realized that there wasn't one, at least in the United States, and there wasn't many in the world in and of itself. Where were you at in your life professionally that made you want to leave law behind and create a museum? I mean, have you had any work with museums and exhibitions in the past? It seems like there's a little bit of a jump, not in the content of the climate museum and your work before, but in terms of the world that they exist in, museums and public institutions versus law. Can you comment on those two?
Yes, absolutely. Why the switch from the, let's say, modality of law to the modality of culture? It crossed my mind that I could bring the litigation skills that I had to the context of the climate crisis, for sure. But I also thought there's so many extraordinarily competent climate lawyers, and we're talking now about 2013, when I first started seriously thinking about the Climate Museum. So shortly after Hurricane Sandy, again, there were then so many outstanding legal departments at major environmental organizations working on the climate crisis. And these were people, mid-career people like me, who were already up to speed on the law governing climate change and its foundations, how it was developing, and so on. It just didn't seem like it was going to add anything new to the mix. And that's part of it. Another way of putting that is that I thought what was most needed was a broad cultural shift toward dialogue around climate, toward people raising their voices together to both support and pressure elected officials on climate. And I still think that that's what we most need. We need many, many things. We need climate finance. We need climate tech. We need studies of the science of climate communications. There's so much that we need. I'm not at all suggesting that arts and cultural work is the only or even the main thing that we need. It's a whole suite of efforts that's required across society. But without the public broadly involved and without a pretty high level of emotional intensity in that involvement, it's my belief that we will not get what we need from our political system, because what we need requires immense commitment for the initial lift, and then it requires immense commitment for it to be sustained over time. And thus far, even the Inflation Reduction Act, while it's a step in the right direction, is only a tiny fraction of what we need. This is leaving aside its active problems and the controversies and critiques that it's generated, even on its own terms, as a market solution for generating cheaper and more access to renewable energy, where it has really shifted the needle. It doesn't do anything to wind down fossil fuels. And in fact, the US is looking to increase exports of methane, which is astounding. It's an astounding juxtaposition, the idea that you think you're addressing the climate crisis when you're expanding the production and use of fossil fuels. That is bonkers. So without a broad public to say that's bonkers,
absolutely.
These kinds of developments will keep happening. And I think so many problems that we face that present as political or ideological are at base cultural and about identity and whether we feel connected to others in taking a position. And I think climate is really exhibit A there.
Absolutely. I want to harper on this point because something that really you guys do so well at the Climate Museum is highlight the fact that the population across the board within the United States want the vast majority want bold action to be enabled by the government against the climate change. Right? We need the majority of people know that we need to take bold action against this. Yet
Yes,
there's this quote unquote silent majority that is constantly mentioned in your work, where there are individuals want change to happen, but we think that there are less of us who want change to be enacted. For a lot of people in that, at least I rub shoulders with, and I live in New York City, obviously for context, and the Climate Museum, of course, is based in New York City. There's a lot of political fragmentation going on in the United States, and that there's a lot of us versus them thinking.
mm,
What message could you tell, let's say, a lot of left-leaning individuals, urban folk, let's say, who aren't exposed to the outdoors, who aren't exposed to rural communities, or even, let's say, conservative communities in the South or in the Midwest and the like, who think that they don't get it, they don't understand. It's an us versus them, blue versus red take on addressing the climate change. Is there something that the left just isn't getting about the collective opinion about addressing climate change?
yes, definitely. I think there's something we're all not getting, but I think there's a particular problem with the left and with progressive communities not getting it
Hmm.
because, in my judgment, we are the communities that are going to have to do the most to get this right.
Hmm.
So when we dismiss whole populations and states um, out of misperceptions, we create an enormous additional headwind that we really don't need, to put it very mildly and politely. The last thing we need is additional headwinds and speed bumps in transitioning to a climate safe and just future. It's plenty hard enough already. So let's not create any additional non-mandatory problems for ourselves. And I'll make this point by circling back to where you started with your question, Yusuf, which is on the bipartisan supermajority for climate justice in the US. Most progressive, politically active New Yorkers would probably be really surprised to hear that 61% of the residents of Mississippi are focused on the climate crisis and very climate concerned.
Mm.
And that's not that different from the New York State number, by the way, which is 74%.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's the same general part of a bell-shaped curve, right?
Hmm.
What we also have in common is that New Yorkers will estimate that number to be in the low 40s, and I can't remember the exact percentage. And Mississippians will tell you that it's 33% of their fellow Mississippians who are climate hawks. So there's a ubiquitous perception in every state that we are in the minority when in fact
Hmm.
we're in the majority. And we should be focusing on those commonalities rather than the differences that, for certain, exist and are unhealthily alive in American political culture. I think it's easy for people to forget that the American public is to the left of registered voters in the US.
Hmm.
And then within registered voters, people who are registered Republicans are less than half of that group. And then within registered Republicans, um, you have a super vocal percentage of people who are for sure engaged in a mass psychosis that touches climate change, it touches racism, it touches immigration policy, it touches basic democratic rights and freedoms. So there's no disputing that there's a small minority of people in our country who have lost it and who, barring changes in their psychology and sense of self, which could 100% happen, but if those changes don't happen, they're a very profoundly negative force in our culture and society. They're fueling the continuing relevance of Donald Trump, which is an astoundingly destructive cultural fact, and in many other ways. It's a serious problem, but we have to remember that that's a small minority of the population of the United States, and that most people want to see really bold action away from fossil fuels and toward renewables, for one thing, and for another thing, for climate justice. So, for example, for reparative payments to the Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities that have been treated as sacrifice zones by the fossil fuel industry. Mm-hmm. Those facts are really surprising to people, and it's really important to get the word out about them. And then I'd just say there can be something emotionally compensatory in not understanding yourself to be part of a majority, right? Like there's this perverse sense of knowing better than the majority. And it's really important for progressives to recognize the molecule of truth in all the nonsense about East Coast latte sipping elitists.
Yes.
There's some truth in that we need to look at and fix. We need some left-wing populism in the mix, not just left-wing elitism. And I think that's why Bernie Sanders was so popular, in my opinion. And that's something that our culture needs and that the climate crisis needs, for certain. We have to recognize where we share opinions. We have to not recognize the problem posed by the deranged, bigoted reactionaries in our society, and also recognize what a small minority of people that is, and not be demoralized, and also not feel superior. Feeling superior might make your morning a little better in some way, but it is not going to help humanity address the multiple crises that we face. So it's not a useful self-indulgence.
Oh, touche on that point. Touche on that point. Miranda, switching gears a little bit more into the logistics of your entrepreneurial journey. Let's go back to the founding of the Climate Museum. You were working as a litigator. You had a great job, and you had this idea, and you went for it. How did you fund the initial work required to create the Climate Museum? Were you basing this off of your own savings? Did you apply for grants and funds? When did you quit the job of a litigator to then work full time for the Climate Museum and for your idea, or was there sort of a big overlap between the two?
There was a medium-sized overlap. Our organization hired a new director, and I had been serving as interim director of the organization, and our board asked me to stay on for a transition period. So that transition period was a period when I was in the evenings working a bit on ideas about the Climate Museum, recruiting our first advisory council members, and otherwise starting to conceive of how we would proceed while also maintaining my day job. So medium-sized overlap. And then my mother would be very sorry to tell you that I liquidated my retirement savings to launch the effort, which seemed like a complete no-brainer to me for a number of reasons, including the fact that my retirement savings as a public interest social justice lawyer were actually not going to fund anybody's retirement. Otherwise, in other ways, it also just seemed like it was just what I wanted to do. It was alarming to a couple of close people in my life. I don't mean to single my mom out unfairly,
No, of course, of course.
and I understand her concerns, but it just seems like a complete no-brainer to me.
Interesting. Interesting. I always have to ask this question to any entrepreneur because we do live in the United States and our healthcare system is the way that it is.
Yeah.
When
Oh,
you left the work as the litigator and you were working full time for the Climate Museum and creating this institution, did you give up your insurance? Did you go
mm,
uninsured for a while?
I'm so
Um,
grateful you're asking that. I think
yeah.
it's really important to highlight this. I could never have started the Climate Museum without the Affordable Care Act
Mm,
because I was able, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, to purchase insurance not through my employer, other than through my employer. And um, there is freedom and there's a creativity that was liberated. I know there have been studies of this that have not been publicized enough and talked about enough, but the economic benefit to the country as a whole of the creativity and the
hmm
entrepreneurialism that were unleashed by the Affordable Care Act, it's an astounding shift in our economy. So I was paying a lot month over month for my own health care,
hmm
um, but I was able to buy health care um, because of the Affordable Care Act, and I am personally grateful and also grateful on behalf of the nation that um,
Yes.
legislation passed. I will quickly add we should have single payer. There should be everybody should. Healthcare is a human right. So I don't mean to sound uncritical of the limitations on the ACA, but it is, without the ACA, I could never have done this, both as a person approaching middle age and also as a person who had previously had a serious health concern. There was no way. I was not risk averse enough financially to make
hmm
my mom happy. When I liquidated my savings, as I
hmm
mentioned, made her very unhappy. But I would never have gone without health care at that time in my life. So that was hugely important. I also want to add something that I
Yeah.
should have mentioned before that I think is pretty significant and often not acknowledged. That I don't come from a wealthy family, but I come from a family with enough resources and enough generosity and kindness toward me
hmm
that there was a sense of a safety net
Mm,
in the event of calamity. And that is not something, to put it um, to put it gently, that everybody in our society has access to, and was clearly for me a precondition. Um, it's just a basic feature of my psychology, knowing that I don't even know how to game out what decisions I would or would not have made without that sense of background security. So a huge shout out to the entrepreneurs out there, because there are a lot of them who make this kind of move without that sense of family safety net that I had.
completely, completely. I mean, you're lucky and fortunate to have that. This, of course, doesn't negate your hard work and your sacrifices to this, but yeah, I mean, community plays a huge role in everyone's
Yes,
life for a myriad of different variables, but of course, the journey of an entrepreneur is particular and can be very isolating at times. And specifically in those early stages when you're making that jump from safety, let's say traditional lifestyles and work and things of that nature, to creating something new that hopefully will be a lifeline to you and many from a financial standpoint, from an organizational standpoint.
right.
During that time of ideation, were you talking openly about this idea of the climate museum with your community, i.e., either professional colleagues or friends and family, or did you keep this idea close to the chest until it became a little bit more real?
I started talking about it right away and started recruiting advisory council
Mm-hmm.
members to give the project intellectual and social credibility right away.
Mm,
So one of the first people was Gus Speth, who's a co-founder both of the Natural Resources Defense Council and the World Resources Institute, and has a bunch of other titles and feathers in his cap as well. Um, another one of the first five was Eddie Bautista, who leads the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, a very well-known architect who has since passed away, who is a family friend. So that was, he was like a found object for the Climate Museum, but I knew we needed a very strong design voice, and he had been the dean of Columbia's architecture school. And so and then a Nobel Peace Prize winning climate scientist who works for NASA. Those were four of the first five advisory council members, and it branched out from there. And to recruit those people, it varied. In some cases, both the architect I mentioned, Jim Polshek was his name, and Eddie Bautista were already people in my life. But many of the other early advisory council members were people I had to ask a common connection for an introduction to. And so I began networking to create a sense of community and momentum around the Climate Museum, as well as a sense of credibility immediately. And for this project, I'm certain that was right. And I would imagine it would be the right move for a lot of other early stage projects. Create a sense of legitimacy and movement and community around it. You've taken a big step forward.
Totally. You mentioned something about ambition earlier, and that's an amazing component I think in many cases, if you want to be an entrepreneur and if you want to start something, you obviously have to be ambitious. But was that reaching out and that networking component to ask for advice or help or time, X, Y, and Z with quote unquote big shots that aren't so close to you? They're one person removed and whatnot. Was that hard? Was that a challenge for you in the beginning, or did that approach come naturally for you?
It's interesting. The first thing to say is that another built-in advantage that I have as a person is that I'm radically extroverted and don't have social anxiety. Pretty much categorically.
That's great.
Yeah, it's very unearned. It's totally unearned. Yeah. I didn't earn it. It's just lucky. But I recognize that it's a huge advantage in many situations, including the situation of starting a new venture like this. Something else I'll say was that I found embracing instructive and interesting to be, in a sense, rewound back to an earlier career moment, because I had gotten to the point in my social justice law career where people returned my calls and my emails. I mean, I was not trying to get in touch with Beyonce, to be fair, but in general, the people who were pertinent to what I was doing knew who I was, and they would get back to me. And then when I started doing this new work in an area where I was rightly not at all known, because it was all new to me as well, I had to go back almost to an earlier moment in my work life, where as a young civil rights attorney, when you're new in a field, you just get used to not being daunted by silence, not even being daunted by no's. That's a no for now. And you just have to be very, very doggedly persistent. Our board chair jokes about this because I think I wrote him 6 or 7 emails before I got a meeting with him. And then we met like 4 or 5 times before he agreed to join the board. So you have to really be prepared to not take things personally. To answer your question, for me, that wasn't hard. But it was a reorientation at first, because I had gotten to a point as a mid-career litigator where I was a known quantity and where people took me seriously, and where I didn't have to write somebody 5 or 6 times to get a meeting, put it like that.
Makes total sense.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, this is good. It's good to be reminded of this. You don't want to get too comfortable with your access, with what you think your access is. So it was a good reminder.
No, of course, it's a humbling moment, and it's an important point to make, specifically for those that are interested in making that transition. I think it goes back. What you're saying reminds me of the concept of like it's too late, or people who are thinking I'm so advanced in my career and whatnot that I don't want to take a risk to do something else and whatnot. But you had that courage to say I'm going to actually try something new and start at the bottom again. And so I acknowledge you for that. That is a courageous thing to do, and not it doesn't come easy to most. So.
Well, I appreciate your saying that, but I have to just let you know that it didn't feel brave at all. It just felt like this is a great project. It's obvious it needs to happen. I know that with a set of skills that I have both from work and just from life, that I can move this forward. And I know it will be really interesting, engaging, and rewarding, regardless of the outcome, honestly. So it felt pretty obvious.
It really sounds like this idea just came as like a light bulb moment. It just came to
Yes.
you, and it just all the stars aligned in terms of I can do this. This feels right, and I'm going to go forward with this.
Yes.
Miranda, on this notion, I mean, have you started anything in the past? Have you ever started an organization before? Have you ever had? What's your experience before the Climate Museum with entrepreneurship?
Well, significantly smaller things. For example, with a couple of friends in college, we launched a journal of arts and politics that was a really meaningful part of my undergraduate experience. And as a young civil rights litigator, I took on some big challenges that felt entrepreneurial, even though it's a very different thing. You're not building an organization. But for example, as a very young and inexperienced lawyer, I was one of the lead attorneys in the University of Michigan affirmative action case that the Supreme Court just struck down, which is a terrible step backward. But
Indeed.
there was definitely that case, which I did in coalition with remarkable organizations that were fighting for racial justice in education. That case felt entrepreneurial at a somewhat similar scale, even though in a different manner, but not in the same manner and at the same scale. I'll put it like that. So it was a new thing in that way.
What can you speak about how being a lawyer trained you or gave you advantages when you started at the Climate Museum? What are the overlaps between that chapter of your work and this entrepreneurial chapter of your work?
I think it was stuff that's specific to being a trial lawyer. I think I had pretty profound recognition of the predominance of emotions in human life and decision making, and the need to connect in particular with juries on an emotional level. And so embedded deeply in the Climate Museum's theory of change is the idea, I would call it a recognition, but in case it's controversial, the idea that we're first and foremost emotional creatures. It's really important to feed the mind and the intellect as well, but our emotions are the primary driver of what we decide to do and what we decide not to do. And I think that sense of the world was honed for me in being a courtroom lawyer, because at the beginning of my legal career, I was a little bit more on the rationalist side. I was a kid who'd been a bookworm, and I grew up with a wonderful but very rationalist and intellectual dad, and really loved school in a way that a lot of people don't. Or I wasn't a disciplined student, but I loved the intellectual project of the interesting classes. And so I was given to a kind of rationalism and hyper intellectualism, and being a trial lawyer will really knock that out of you, because
I
it's
can imagine.
yeah, it's really about, and it's true of opposing counsel and the judges as well, though they would be loath to admit it. But where we're at emotionally is what really it decides where we land on things. And so recognizing that, I think, is pretty critical to the decision to start a museum that would mobilize the arts, which are so tied into our emotional selves for climate action. So I think that's a thread that runs through it. Another thing I'd flag, though perhaps this is more of a side point, is just there are a lot of things about legal training that are not that helpful for doing this work. But it is definitely the case that identifying what the risks are in a situation, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you act to avoid risk, but knowing what the risks are and being lucid about them is a skill that's critical to have. That it's critical to have as a lawyer, and I think that it has served me well in directing the course of development of the Climate Museum as well. Trying to take a step back, be a devil's advocate, see the other side of either doing or not doing a project or an exhibition or making an argument a certain way, and not having that be fraught with anxiety and moralism that you're somehow jumping ship or not being true to the cause. If you think about the other side of things and think about risk, I think that kind of ability to zoom out and see both sides of different questions is pretty important as well.
No, that makes sense, and I think that that point of view really comes across in the exhibitions and the work that the Climate Museum does. As someone that's been to your different pop-ups and different events throughout the city, I can say firsthand that it definitely comes through in the work that you guys put out. You guys do an amazing job of painting the broader picture, right? Giving that global perspective on the problem, backed by science, but articulating it in a way that's engageable, that's approachable to someone who doesn't necessarily know the facts and figures behind these big emotional bearing problems that we are faced with when it comes to the Climate Museum. And then, of course, pointing them in a direction and feeding the viewer through to a point where it's a sense of, I don't want to say hope because that's a loaded word, but a sense of I can do something as an individual to make my part in combating the climate crisis. For those listening, the Climate Museum is an amazing institution for a myriad of reasons, but one thing that I love about it is that in every, let's say, pop-up or exhibition or any place that the Climate Museum is at, there's place they have a place that directs the viewer and directs the audience members to what they can actually do next steps, right? When it comes to your wall of stickers and your letters to the government and whatnot, it just really facilitates individual action, which is required to make the larger changes that we need. Not saying that that's the only component that we need, but it uplifts people in a way and in a space and at a problem that, to your point earlier, makes people feel lonely and isolated and hopeless in a way. What can be done? But you guys do a great job of walking the people through the entire thing.
That's tremendously gratifying to hear. That's really the whole point of our work. So it's wonderful to hear you say that.
No, of course, it's super true. And again, all links to the Climate Museum and all work that Miranda has done will be included in the note descriptions below. I would be remiss to not talk about this. As someone who has experience both in law, with activism directly, and of course with the arts and a museum, what are your thoughts on this recent wave of quote unquote activism and art? I don't even know the actual right term to describe this, but the art activism vandalizing that has been going around in Europe and the United States, when climate specific activists are quote unquote throwing paint or gluing themselves to famous works of art in museum in hopes to bring attention to the climate crisis. What's your take on that whole movement?
It's interesting. I wrote a longish piece about this, and then the opportunity arose to condense it into a letter to the editor when the Times ran a particularly unhelpful journalistic take on one of the incidents that you're referring to. And so it ended up being condensed as a letter to the editor. I have a few things to say about that. The first is that it's not often recognized enough how intense the first wave of protesters who engaged in these activities in museums were on not causing any damage to any art. Indeed, they consulted with conservators to ask about the types of glue that would be least likely to damage the varnish of frames when they were gluing their hands to frames. And many of them have since started gluing their hands to the wall beside a painting rather than to anything touching the painting itself. So this is not uniform or universal, but there's generally been a good deal of care to avoid damage to artwork. That said, there's still a risk of damage to artwork. There's social costs, and if you're a museum security guard, say you're a climate activist who's also a museum security guard, and you have to drag somebody away when you agree with their critique and their point, that's a social cost. And there are some expressions of this kind of tactic. I'm thinking of the U.S. Open, one of the matches in the U.S. Open being interrupted at some length, where there was a communications opportunity in that moment of protest that was missed. And there's also an additional element of unfairness to holding a whole stadium hostage, and in particular to the two players who are battling it out on the court. That adds a different element that I think it's important to take into consideration. But one thing you won't hear from me is a loud condemnation of disruptive tactics like this. I disrespect those condemnations deeply. We're in a planetary emergency. Good luck making art if we don't take really assertive climate action now to address this crisis. You're going to be spending all your time trying to find food for your family. You're not going to be able to make paintings. So there's a level of urgency to the climate crisis that these activists are trying to express that I'm fundamentally very sympathetic to. As a follow-on to that, I would also say, and this is a little bit of an on the other hand point, I don't think this is a great way to build a mass movement, either of the general population or even of vanguard activists, both of which are enormously significant. The Climate Museum is more focused on the broader public. But even if you're trying to build a large vanguard activist movement, I don't think this is, in this moment of history, an effective way to do that. And I do think that's something that we deeply need. So I'd love to see efforts that advance that goal more effectively and efficiently. I will also say, I remember Extinction Rebellion. This is adjacent, not exactly on the subject of the art museums. Extinction Rebellion did a series of wildly disruptive protests, I think just before the COVID shutdown, and they were criticized and decried. And there was a massive shift in public opinion in the UK that was clearly caused by the fact that Extinction Rebellion had elevated people's awareness of the degree of urgency of the climate crisis by engaging in these actions. So there was a massive shift that I cannot remember the exact question that was being polled, but it was, I believe, up for legislative action at that moment. So there were frequent polls happening on it, and the before and after polls told the whole story. These protests do generate conversation. They do increase awareness. And even in the journalistic accounts of the stuff that's been happening in museums, you hear visitors across the spectrum, but often really supportive, saying, yeah, we understand this is a way of drawing attention to the subject. Like, yes, was it annoying to have my experience interrupted by it? Yeah, sure, a little. But like Coco Gauff, the amazing tennis player whose match was interrupted at the U.S. Open, there's also been a lot of opinions put out. Like, I get it, I understand that this is necessary too. So that just goes to show there's a supermajority. How we convey our opinions as climate activists to that supermajority and to the elected officials who are lagging way behind where the supermajority is a question that should be up for a healthy, non-moralistic, and open-hearted debate at all times. But I think it's a tactic that may be outliving its usefulness. It seems to me that there's a little bit of diminishing returns on the initial awareness that it was bringing to the climate crisis. But you will not hear me condemn it.
No, I resonate a lot with your points of view. I think it's important to note for the audience members that besides the highlights of activist throws paint at a masterpiece from the 1400s, a lot of the times, as to your point, Miranda, they have selected pieces of art that they know are protected, not just from an insurance standpoint, but from a physical standpoint. The glass that these paintings are enshrined in is extremely protective, and most of the time, if not almost all the times, the work of art is not actually harmed in and of itself. I think it's a lot of they do it selectively.
I just wanted to say, to my knowledge, there's no work of art that's been harmed. There has been there has been some cost for museums to cleaning up the paint, reframing pieces. There are risks in that. There's exposure to oxygen. It's not risk-free, and I don't want to misrepresent my understanding of the situation or sound one-sided on it. But I don't think anybody has a single work of art in their collection that's been harmed. There's been some minor damage to frames and pedestals and stuff like that. So
no, the completely 100%. Like for all the research that I've done, no actual works of art have been damaged. And again, the activists have done the research in selecting the correct ones. But yes, I think the risk is actually more to the larger public. In the UK, obviously, a lot of these acts of activism were conducted in the UK. Polling showed that people thought that this was actually a bad thing. Again, this is polling the general public, not necessarily those who are extremely involved in the movement. But the general public is like, why would you do this to a piece of artwork? But at the end of the day, all of these things combined are what collectively shape the general public's consensus and point of view on the climate crisis. Seldom is it that one individual act of protest is what single-handedly changes the minds of individuals across the board. It's a collective measure of seeing these acts and watching the news and reading about and seeing the headlines around other environmental problems, going to the grocery store, going to the shopping mall and seeing all the, this bottle is made out of 50% recycled plastic and X, Y, and Z. They're seeing the wave of change going across different sectors, right? Seeing that in November, it could reach, 80 degrees or something of that nature, right? All these things combined typically add in to raise the bar of attention and focus that the average individual is putting towards the climate crisis. And again, your work adds to that as well. When people see an advertisement for the Climate Museum, or they walk by your studio and walk by your exhibition in Soho and the like, it adds to the noise around, hey guys, wake up, there's a serious issue at hand. We need to all be collectively doing something about it.
Well said. Absolutely agreed. And it's also true that we humans are super contradictory. So there could be a tactic that we see that we dislike, and if we're polled, we say we dislike it, and it can still shift our opinion in a healthy and positive direction. We're full of contradictions, and that was the case with the Extinction Rebellion protests that I believe largely launched that organization in England before COVID. People declared themselves to be opposed to the tactics, but the demonstrations shifted public opinion on climate in a really positive way. So it's complex territory, and I think we are faced with an unprecedented situation, and there are going to be a lot of tributaries, as you just said, Yusuf.
Completely. Miranda, two last questions. One, what does success look like for you personally and for your organization in the next 5 and 10 years?
Well, in operational terms, for the Climate Museum, I would define it as having a long-term space and being a year-round exhibiting organization, doing the kind of context-sensitive work that we've been doing, justice-focused, community building, arts mobilizing, work that takes account of the really rapid shifts in public opinion on climate to make interventions that are helpful to people and help people feel a sense of resolve, help people see their own agency year round in an ongoing way. That's the goal. And more broadly, I think to feel that we've contributed, and this is impossible to measure in any clear, precise way, but to feel that we've contributed to the kind of cultural shift across the board that we need to see on the climate crisis in public expression and in how people go about their daily lives and their civic lives. To feel that we've made a contribution to moving our public culture to the place where it needs to be for us to get the government action and the action from private sector scale actors that we need to see to meaningfully address the crisis. That's the dream, and that's the goal.
Well said. Well said. Miranda, is there any other last messages that you want to leave the audience with?
I just want to recapitulate something and add something to it. If you've been thinking about climate for a while and feeling badly about it, you're not alone, you're in a huge majority of US adults who are thinking about climate, feeling bad about it. We've all been brainwashed by the idea of the carbon footprint, by the way, Yusuf, which was brought to us by BP in 2004. The climate crisis is not your fault. It is also true that everyone can take meaningful action on the climate crisis, and that once you start figuring out what you want those actions to be for you, you will feel an immense sense of relief in addressing this crisis that we all now confront together. So believe in yourself and be compassionate toward yourself if you've been thinking about this for a while but haven't yet taken action on it. My lag in that regard was years long. And for most people, there's at least some lag. And that's a perfectly understandable thing. To feel outscaled by a crisis that is global is a rational and normal response. And to feel guilty about our own consumption when we've been trained to do that by incessant and fraudulent advertising campaigns that are exceptionally well funded is also very normal as a human response. So be easy on yourself and take steps to figure out what your specific and individual contribution to moving us forward can be.
Well said, Miranda. And to that point and on this conclusion of this episode, I just want to appreciate you again for all that you do and for all that the Climate Museum has done to bring attention and not just uplift, but give almost like an emotional hug to so many people that have walked through your exhibitions and engaged with your museum, that felt alone, felt isolated, felt overwhelmed by this problem. But again, to my point earlier, feel empowered to do something and feel that sense of community that the Climate Museum has been able to provide. But really, Miranda, on a personal note, you are living your authentic self, and as a result, throughout your time as a lawyer and obviously at the Climate Museum, you've really touched the lives of a lot of people and in more ways than one. So I appreciate you for that. And again, to all those that are listening, if you're ever in New York or for wherever the Climate Museum will be in the future, I highly recommend that you guys check it out. It's an amazing place that you learn so much. It's fun exhibitions. You guys do a lot of great stuff. So All links will be attached in the description of this episode, as I said. And Miranda, again, I just appreciate you and your time. So thank you so much for joining. This has been
Thank
great.
you so much, Yusuf. This has been wonderful, and I can't begin to express how much I appreciate your kind words about the museum and our approach. It's profoundly meaningful to me and on behalf of the team for all of us. So thank you.